There are moments in these processes that you really never forget. And so I accompanied one of the DDR base closures, and I was eavesdropping, as I often do, a conversation between the two soldiers behind me. And it almost broke my heart because one of them said to the other, we've been here for so long. Do you think my kids will recognize me? Do you think we can ask the Peace Process Secretariat for a DNA that I can prove that I'm their father, that I'm the same person? I don't think they'll remember me. It stopped me in my tracks in a huge way.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast that explores the intersection of peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. The interview you're about to hear is among the best we've done in over 3 years of making this podcast. It concerns one of the least visible peace processes of the past decade. I found this conversation incredibly inspiring. Our guest, Neha Sanghrajka, spent almost a decade in Mozambique as a lead mediator between the government and a guerrilla group called Renamo. The work was slow but yielded meaningful results. The two parties signed a peace agreement in 2019, and over 5,000 militants turned in their weapons and rejoined society. Neha and her colleagues did things differently from past peace processes, and that took a whole lot of patience and dedication. Instead of convening the warring leaders in a room together, the peacebuilders decided to meet the parties where they were. That included scaling a mountain by foot 45 times to meet with Renamo's leader. And they set up bases in remote areas where the militants lived, so fighters would feel more comfortable giving up their guns. The peacebuilders also walked a delicate line. They wanted to protect the negotiations from too much scrutiny. At the same time, they wanted to engage the media and civil society with the implementation of the process, because public support for the peace agreement is always critical. Neha's story presents a fascinating example of how polarized groups can actually buy into a process of reconciliation, despite major setbacks along the way. It also shows how journalists can report responsibly and critically while still supporting the peace process. Here's my conversation with Neha Sanghrajka. Neha, let's start by telling your story. You describe yourself as an accidental mediator. How did you find your way into the profession?
This was never my plan, or I never imagined myself to be in this position. I grew up in Kenya, studied law, and then moved to the UK. I lived in the UK for a long time. In 2007, my father passed away quite suddenly. And before I knew it, I had family obligations back in Nairobi. So I left London to go back to Kenya. And I couldn't find a legal job in Nairobi. And it just so happened that 2007, we had elections and faced our own electoral crisis. It was quite a page-turning, substantive conflict. The African Union and the UN at the time sent Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, together with Graça Machel and Benjamin Mkapa, the former president of Tanzania, to mediate. I started working for the Kofi Annan Peace Process Secretariat in 2007, and that changed my outlook. I spent the next 7 years working on the Kenya process, the implementations, the agreements, and I realized I didn't want to do anything but this. Then I decided to try something new and went to Mozambique with the Humanitarian Dialogue Center.
Well, you found your role, I think. Mozambique's history of conflict goes back to the time when it first achieved independence from Portugal in the 1970s. But it's a country that many of our listeners may not be familiar with. Can you give us some general background about Mozambique and its journey to where it is now?
Mozambique is often misunderstood. It's Portuguese speaking, so it locks out a lot of the English speaking part of the world. And it is often overshadowed by South Africa, but it has a completely different personality. I realized almost instantly it's very different from Kenya. The Mozambican people are amazing. They're calmer. It's a country that went through a very, very long 17-year almost civil war. And the peace agreement in 1992 gave birth to most of the institutions and sort of a new Mozambique. When I got involved in Mozambique, it was 2013. It was a couple of years before the presidential elections, and there was low-scale conflict between the government and Renamo. The leader of Renamo at the time, Lakama, was fighting for decentralization, was fighting for elected governors, basically fighting for belonging. Most conflict, when you boil it down, it is a case of wanting to belong, wanting to be part of something. And so that's how I started in Mozambique. I went to Mozambique for 6 months just for one assignment, and I ended up staying there for almost 10 years.
The most recent peace process in Mozambique started around 2016. And that's the one that you worked on, working with the United Nations. And I think it was the Swiss ambassador. Is that right?
Yeah.
It's called the Maputo Accord process. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I'd like to take the listeners down just a little bit before in history, just before this. And that'll help contextualize how the process, which I like to call the Swiss process, or the Maputo Accord, which was eventually signed years later. There was a process 6 months before, so between July 11th and December 2016. It was called the Avenida process. It was European Union led with Mario Raffaelli and Sant'Egidio, and they were the architects of the 1992 peace agreement in Mozambique. So this process was really interesting to me, but also extremely eye-opening. I learned a lot during these 6 months, predominantly how not to do things. That process had almost 13 mediators. I was the only woman sitting around the table. We were more mediators than they were parties to the conflict. On the side of the mediators, there was the former president of Tanzania, former president of Botswana, Jonathan Powell from Intermediate, but who's now in the British government. And then there was myself, the Vatican, and the list goes on and on. So from saying that, you understand that there were too many people in the room. Now, adding on to that, note takers and the fact that the media were outside the door, full court press the whole day from 8 in the morning to 5 in the evening. Everything that was said in the room was relayed outside. Maybe this was an effort for transparency. And of course, this was very important. And there were a lot of sort of big people in the room. And so they wanted to know what was going on. It was not conducive. The two sides just shut down. They just stopped speaking. And it was 6 months of sort of forced back and forth. At the table, I met Jonathan Powell, and we were like-minded. So we decided, let's try and find a way around this. We met Mirko Manzoni, who was the Swiss ambassador in Mozambique at the time. And he had a good relationship with Renamo and Lakama, and we had a good relationship with the government. So we decided to form a quiet back channel to try and unplug and iron out some of these kinks, so to speak. And that gave birth to the process you're talking about in 2017.
So in this new regime that you created, describe your role as a mediator. I mean, from the report you issued recently, it sounds very hands-on. You lived in Mozambique. You made 45 trips between Maputo and the Renamo headquarters. Tell us more about exactly what the nitty-gritty of what you were doing there.
So we realized very quickly that there was a deficit of trust across the board. And in order to build that trust, the first thing that needed to be, I guess, visible is consistency. Because consistency shows that you care. Consistency shows lack of a personal agenda, that you actually care about what's going on enough to stay put for a while. So yes, I did decide to stay in Mozambique, and as did Mirko. And as for the trips back and forth, we wanted to not only be consistent, but also treat everyone with dignity and humility. So going to them often means that we're the ones who have to struggle to get there. I mean, going to the mountain, for me in particular, was not easy. I'm not the most active human in the world, and nor do I like hiking. So climbing that mountain already was awful for me.
That was a commitment.
If you were to ask me beforehand, I never would have done it. But Mirko, my Swiss colleague, well, he's a Swiss mountaineer. So for him, it was like a walk in the park any other Sunday. But I think when Renamo saw us consistently, and particularly me struggling to climb that mountain, which I really hated, I think that built a lot of trust. Yeah. But also it was, understanding. We realized that we needed to be in the shoes of both sides. So we wanted to try and understand in real time, because when you're working on peace agreements or when you're trying to build peace and you focus on frameworks, you focus on best practices, and you focus on what is written, you often miss the intangible, the emotion, the empathy, the real life struggle that has resulted in this.
I'm interested in this obstacle that you faced of climbing the mountain in order to meet with the Renamo leaders. Tell us a little more about that mountain and why were they there?
We began when things were pretty tough and the conflict was ongoing in a very real sense. And Afonso Lacama, the leader of Renamo, had fled to the bush, to his comfort zone in Sofala province. And so from the capital city, Maputo, which is nice and comfortable, you kind of fly to Beira, which is the closest capital city in central Mozambique. And from there, it's almost a 5 or 6 hour drive, and then around 6 or 7 hours walk.
Wow.
To reach the place where he was. So he would send soldiers to a particular point where we could go with the car. And then from then on, we had to walk. Eventually, we got little motorcycles. Again, those terrified me. I'd never been on one, but you learn, right? And
Right.
or you just have to do it. Personally, for me, heavily overweight, not very physically fit, many obstacles apart leading with the fact that I really don't like exercise. I know it's good for me, but so climbing a mountain or nature, I'm a city girl. And so being out in nature isn't exactly the first thing on my mind. And the mountain, it was very rural and you had very real concerns. I caught cerebral malaria being there once a few years down the line when we went back and forth. You have wildlife. It was difficult. And even our first ever meeting with Lacama, we were perched on this mountaintop on these very unsteady plastic chairs. And I just kept looking down thinking, I could just fall off this cliff. Now, as I said, I might be being a bit dramatic purely because of my own personal failings, but suffice to say, I did not look forward to those trips. But over time, I decided to lose weight, practice walking. And so they got easier and easier. And by the 40th trip, it was much better. I could do it easily. And so for me, it was also a learning and a growing experience of going there. And I had to keep focused on why I was doing that. And humor works.
Yeah, humor does work.
Humor works because our colleagues around us, including Mirko, was quite funny and kept me distracted. And the soldiers were, in difficult times, in times of struggle, you understand the human capacity to be generous.
Well, you demonstrated your commitment in a very real way there. I'm sure that contributed to the trust that they felt. And by the way, to our listeners, the report I mentioned is available for anyone to read. It's published in Negotiation Journal in December. And in that report, you detail the ways in which the peace process was different from previous attempts. And you focus on the concept called peace listening. Tell us what peace listening is and what's new about that approach.
Peace listening is we listened without an objective. We listened without an outcome. Active listening or any other kind of listening, you're constantly thinking, your brain is constantly thinking of what do I need? What do I want out of this conversation? What do I need an agreement on? It's a little bit transactional. Whereas peace listening is a little bit meditative. There's a lot of freedom in it. You listen to the struggles, their side of history, on both sides. We did this on both sides. There were times that we went to the mountain or the Presidencia in Maputo, and we waited for hours and hours just listening to whatever people wanted to talk about. And we never pushed ever for any outcome. We just kind of let it settle. This was a huge risk because, you could have a year go by without any results. So again, there has to be a middle ground between pushing for things and actually just waiting. And so peace listening was very much about listening without responding, without a need to respond. Sometimes silence is really golden.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And that too builds trust, that people know you're listening, you're really hearing their side of the story. Makes a huge difference.
Here's what people kind of misunderstand. You don't have to agree with it. I spent a lot of time listening to people whose values I may not agree with, but also whose opinion I do not share. But that doesn't mean that I object to them holding that.
Right.
And
that's an important distinction.
It's a very important distinction because this, in a way, kind of reduces polarization. Just because I'm listening and acknowledging your side of the story does not mean that I agree, but I agree to listen to it enough for us to come up with a common solution for the betterment of all.
At Making Peace Visible, we focus on how peace efforts are reported in the media, or not, as is often the case. The Maputo process involves some strategy around how best to engage with the media. Can you discuss your approach and how it incorporated lessons learned from the previous peace process?
So as I mentioned, the previous ones were overly visible. And so therefore, we designed a process that was more circumspect, that met in the middle. Here's some of the reasons why. Peace is extremely, extremely personal. And so the solution must be personal. You cannot remove emotion, empathy, feelings from any peace process. So, of course, there are moments where one side or the other will say and do things and act in a way that maybe they wouldn't 1 month down the line. And in terms of negotiation and mediation, one thing you are trying to do is holding the space for when rationality sets in. Now, in the middle of all of that, if that was publicized, then you get a completely different reaction. So discretion is key, confidentiality is key. And the way we did it is strategically. We kept the public process, as I said, open and public and managed the communication flowing. And on the other hand, we took the confidentiality extremely seriously. We kept that secret. But the way to do that is not to have an ego. And that's extremely difficult because in today's world, in this instant communication kind of atmosphere we live in, everybody wants to show they're doing something. If you're acting or doing something in the peace building sector where you have no pressure to act a certain way, to project yourself a certain way, or answer in a certain way, that also gives you a lot of freedom. What we also did was that we decided that the 5 major, I guess, media personalities in Mozambique, they needed to be allies to the peace process. They could report and judge the process, but not the intent behind it. So what we did is consistently briefed them in a very transparent and open way and told them openly what we can and cannot say. And at the end of the day, that kind of did work. When we would see news reports coming out, which were inaccurate, we had a good enough relationship to phone and ask and clarify.
That's very important. Very,
Yeah.
very important.
And on principle, we reacted to media, but we never reacted to Facebook posts or WhatsApp groups, anything that was not verified. And that was a challenge. I must admit, yesterday I fell in the same trap. I saw on social media breaking news of something that was going to happen to someone I know. I called the person and asked, and it wasn't true. So again, it's an everyday challenge. It's a new, brave new world.
Yeah, it is a brave new world. I mean, you've explained very well the advantage of keeping the terms of a major peace negotiations hidden while the parties are still considering it. But on the other hand, if the details of the negotiation aren't made public, then how do you get the civil society to buy into the process?
Yeah, the peace process architecture and design was completely public. And the work that they were doing was also completely public. Civil society was a part of that architecture.
I'm sure, especially the decentralization part.
Absolutely. This decentralization agreement that they were working on, or the amendment to the constitution that elected central governors, was ratified by parliament. In fact, unanimously. It was one of my most favorite moments where never before had every single member of parliament been in the room to vote yes to this amendment to the bill, which changed then fundamentally this idea of belonging. And so it was public and the civil society were a part of that. The only part that was discreet, confidential, was the back channel. It was the dealings directly between Lakama and then Osufu Momade, because Lakama died midway through the process. Another shock. And so the new leader, and then the president, Filipe Nyusi. So the dealings that me and Mirko would have with them, that was the back channel. It was confidential.
So, looking at this whole picture, do you have any advice for journalists covering conflict or peace and reconciliation efforts?
I do. I would say before you're reporting on something, think of what your objective is. What is the goal? Is there a do no harm part or element of your reporting? Transparency is crucial, but the dignity of a people and the long-term gains from responsible reporting are even better. And that's something that you will benefit from. One of my favorite quotes is from Gramsci. And it's, I'm a pessimist because of intelligence, but I'm an optimist because of will. And I would say not only journalists, but everybody should try to be optimistic about things, even in the depths of strife, because optimism is difficult, whereas pessimism is extremely easy.
Yeah, that's very true. But in the international media, Mozambique gets very little attention. How do you think that relative invisibility affects the prospect of peace there compared to conflicts that make major global headlines like Israel and Ukraine, for example?
I think there are two sides to this. On one hand, it was extremely beneficial because we could make strides and gains, and we had less spoilers to manage. We had less attention to manage and less global power plays to manage because Mozambique was fairly hidden. But on the other hand, it was also negative when we were struggling to get the story out. We were struggling to get attention onto the country. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, like a lot of things. Yeah.
Like a lot of things.
Well, I love the idea of peace listening you talked about earlier, creating time and space to understand different perspectives, prioritize humanity, and build empathy. What did you learn as a mediator during the listening sessions?
I think I learned the most important thing is to protect the process. Insulating the process from the people is the most important thing. And I'll go into why I think this and what the eventual results of this were. There were two cyclones. There was a conflict brewing slowly in northern Mozambique. I mean, I was there like 10 years. So at certain times, both sides were either annoyed at each other or not speaking, etc. But the one thing that they agreed on consistently throughout the process was that the Peace Process Secretariat was not to blame. The process itself, nobody criticized. Both leaders criticized each other and people generally, civil society, etc. But they didn't criticize the process. And for me, that was the key. It was the hidden secret sauce that all processes need, because conflict is apparent everywhere. We're geared towards conflict as we are geared towards peace. But what matters the most is protecting the process itself. And so as long as we acted with integrity, with one goal in mind, and honesty and humility, that protected. And so when I was listening to all of that, that's what I'm most proud of. That even today, we left the country, but we're genuinely missed by both sides. And that's key.
That's great. That's a real accomplishment. So how do you get from peace listening to the nuts and bolts of the agreements?
At the same time, it's done at the same time. We went back and forth on these documents and literally line by line agreeing, which is why it took 45 trips to the bush over the course of so many years to get to La Cama, because it was important to us that every line of the agreement was agreed.
Yeah, and in the midst of it, one of the major challenges that you mentioned earlier was that the leader of Renamo died suddenly in the middle of negotiations. And how did you handle that setback?
That was a shock. He died of pneumonia. It was between a few days. On a Thursday, we understood he was sick. We moved heaven and earth to get to the mountain in time. And we were about 6 hours late. 6 hours and he had passed away. Now, again, very crucial, the media in this as well, because they could have cast aspersions. But in that moment of such weightiness and gravity, every single newspaper understood this is not the time to... Basically, there was a lot of responsible reporting. And so it was actually the civil society, it was the people of the country that helped keep it together. He was the only face of Renamo. So they had their most famous, the person that they believed in, suddenly die. And it would be very easy to have 5 or 6 different narratives on that. The other thing we did was we impressed upon the government that this is a huge moment and it could go either way. And because of the trust that we built, because of the weightiness of the moment and the relationship that we had built between the president and the Renamo leader, when La Cama died, President Nyusi afforded him what they call it's similar to a state funeral.
Wow.
An official funeral. And that was amazing because the eulogy was given by the president.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite amazing.
That was amazing. The respect that he afforded this fallen opposition leader was extremely important. It showed 2 things. One, it wasn't performative because you could see it in the actions. But 2, it met the moment. And it also acknowledged the part that La Cama played in Mozambican society from the beginning.
Right. And it said, you matter.
You matter.
Absolutely. That's a fascinating story. A major part of this process was the disarmament of over 5,000 Renamo combatants. And these former militants had to be reintegrated into society. And that sounds like a delicate process. How did it go, and how does reintegration happen?
The whole DDR process, the very act of giving up a lifestyle that you've known since birth, you've only ever lived in the bush. So for these people, it was extremely difficult to then even imagine of a future where they're normal civilians. So our process, again, as I mentioned, was centered around dignity. Normal DDR processes would say that the combatants would come to a capital city and then be demobilized there, where it's comfortable for us, which is there's electricity, there's banking systems. But we decided from the beginning, no, we would go to them. We would make life as comfortable for the combatants as we could, even if it meant pain for us. So it was quite fascinating. The 16 bases that we demobilized were in places that I'm sure most Mozambicans have never even been. They were in the villages, they were in the most remote areas, and we spent a lot of money, time, and rebuilding infrastructure to make that happen. So it was the Peace Process Secretariat that went and negotiated with the banks in Maputo that, no, take your banking services there. We negotiated with Vodacom. Put up a mast. We need this done. And so basically, it was a big machinery that moved from place to place, demobilizing. The combatant would climb down the mountain and come to that point. And then each booth or each section was designed in a way that by the end of that process, by the end of the 2 or 3 hours, or even 6 hours in some case, depending, that person would leave with a birth certificate, a DDR card, an ID card, a bank card.
All those things make them a citizen, in effect. I mean,
exactly. Belongings. Belonging was always the center of everything. And so, most importantly, we also had the psychosocial support. It was a 2 or 3 day cycle. They lived in the assembly areas for 2 or 3 days, and they were given psychosocial support, how to interact outside. Each combatant was given a mobile phone. We set up a linea verde, which is a green line, and each combatant could call anytime the Peace Process Secretariat for any reason. We were a problem-solving little office at the time as well. And so each person was taken care of. So there are moments in these processes that you really never forget. And so I accompanied one of the DDR base closures, and I was walking, and behind me were a couple of soldiers, and I was eavesdropping, as I often do, a conversation between the 2 soldiers behind me. And it almost broke my heart because one of them said to the other, we've been here for so long. Do you think my kids will recognize me? Do you think we can ask the Peace Process Secretariat for a DNA that I can prove that I'm their father, that I'm the same person? I don't think they'll remember me. It stopped me in my tracks in a huge way because I suddenly realized the very real thoughts that go through a soldier's minds. The other part of this was the very human element of the person going back to a community. Will this community accept them? Will they want this? For about a year, because of our research and because of the homework we had done, we knew the areas that the combatants wanted to go back to. So we made sure that those areas would see the benefits of having them, that they're not accepting back former combatants who have been killing and in the bush and fighting, but that they bring a positivity back to that village. And how did we do that? We set up a reintegration network. So often, people love recreating new bodies, new things, new organizations, new everything. We decided at the outset that the peace process would not be implementing anything. There was already a robust development sector. There was a robust aid sector. All we needed to do was coordinate. So we set up a reintegration network and we shared information. We were transparent. The Swiss and the Finns are building wells. Can they do it in this area? The Chinese are building these roads. Can they deviate to those roads? So when you spend a year making life better in those areas, the community starts to see the difference. They start to see the brand of the peace process.
Tangible, positive results.
Tangible, positive results. And the government also played a very important role in terms of all through down from the presidency to the mayor to the provincial governors, all the way down to the district commanders. They had the same messaging. They had the language of peace. Renamo, the combatants were not referred to as armed bandits or anything negative. They were referred to as former combatants. So the language is extremely important. How you phrase things, what you say.
Absolutely.
The language of peace is the next big thing. That is, I think, should be central, kindness and humanity. And so we worked with the Ministry of Education to change the curriculum of how Mozambique talks about its history.
Wow, that's critical.
Yeah, there were a lot of aspects to the PPS. I feel like we were constantly busy doing something.
Yeah, I'll say. So when did you know that it was time to leave Mozambique?
It was time to leave Mozambique when the last base was closed and when the main wish or goal or objective was fulfilled. And that was something that we haven't spoken about yet, but it was central from day one, the issue of pensions. So the one thing that the peace processes before did not achieve was securing pensions for the combatants. And in fact, there is no country, including Colombia today, that the government gives pensions, that combatants are integrated into the national pension system. And so that was a separate negotiation for about 3 years. Basically, in a nutshell, what we secured in Mozambique at the very end was a pensions decree was passed in parliament, which basically made it law for those 5,221 combatants to be integrated into a pension system.
Wow, that's quite an achievement.
That was, I think, the most important thing. And at the end of the day, the reason why this was so important was, again, I go back to the central notion of belonging. At the end of the day, it's not the money that matters as much as the fact that they have relevance, that they belong, and that they have some pride and dignity. And so achieving that was quite difficult in the sense that you had to convince one side to give a benefit to the other side, which in their mind, they don't deserve. And on the other side, that's all they want. They want to belong to this side. And for them, it's the world view. The view of one side is they're fighting us. The view of the other side is we just want to be part of you. And never the twain shall meet.
And reconciling those two.
Those two. Exactly.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting.
So that was historic.
Yes.
I believe today people want quick wins. People want the headlines. They want the Twitter or Instagram followers. They want the big headlines and they want to move on to another country, another place. And I think in Mozambique, it succeeded because we just took the time.
Well, that's wonderful. The field of peace building is rapidly changing. I mean, one important aspect of the change is that donor countries in North America and Europe are pulling back on financial support for peace efforts. The United Nations is also in a difficult position. How can peace builders stay nimble and be effective in this changing environment?
Things are becoming more localized. There are new actors that are in consideration. But what fundamentally, I think peace builders are going back to the roots, I suppose. It's two ways. We can either grieve the loss of what is happening, or we can build a new future. We can build a new way of doing things. And I think what peace builders need to remember is there is always a solution. There are other avenues. Think outside the box. What was so special about the Mozambique process is that we didn't have any blueprint to go off of. And so I suppose that if that is replicated now, it's being forcefully replicated in the sense that people have to do things differently now. What I would say, get comfortable with the uncomfortable. I would say to all peace builders, if you're going into it for comfort, then work in a bank or go do something else. It is tough, but the fulfillment that comes from solving what is seemingly a simple challenge is unparalleled.
And, you know, something that I think we're learning in America is that everybody has to be part of the process. We're dealing with these, in some cases, fabricated differences between groups. You know, we all have to take a role in the process.
I think in that, the reason why, and this is just me as an observer from the outside, I think the reason that this is what you just described as festering is because of a lack of dialogue. There's internal dialogue between one side and internal dialogue between the other, and it's an echo chamber.
Everybody's in a separate silo.
And I hear about bridging the divide and talking across lines, etc., but it's much harder than it actually looks.
No, it is a real, very difficult challenge. Can you talk about the challenges that Mozambique is facing now in 2026?
Yeah, I think there is the very real challenge of climate, the floods.
They've been devastating.
Recently, they had devastating floods and, conflict, climate, natural disasters. At the end of the day, that is what either builds or breaks a society. Man-made problems you can resolve. How do you resolve this?
Right.
So the great swaths of the country are devastated. People have lost everything, similar to your wildfires in California. Obviously not the same. But again, in the environment of aid already shrinking, people and countries and policies being less generous, Mozambique will struggle a lot, and so will a lot of other countries with the next disaster. So the floods is obviously one. The second is the conflict in Cabo Delgado, which has seeped all the way down the east coast of Africa and the Indian Ocean to Cabo Delgado and the extremist problem there. So that is also taking attention away from building the country and rather just firefighting the next crisis.
Well, there's no lack of challenges, but the journey you described is really, really interesting. And I'm so glad that you joined us today to talk about it. I hope it helps journalists understand the ins and outs of a long, challenging peace process, because they play a role, but it's a critical thing to learn to play exactly the right role. Thank you so much, Neha. I really appreciate your insights into this conflict.
Thank you so much. It's been really lovely and a pleasure to walk down memory lane a little bit and to speak to you. I'm always reminded of the words Kofi Annan said once to me when I was complaining about something or the other, I'm sure. And he said, you have to wake up every morning wanting to fight for the rule of law and human rights, because in a flash, they may be gone.
Well, that's so true. That is so, so true. Neha Sanghrajka is currently a fellow at the Harvard Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. There's a link in our show notes to Neha's case analysis of the peace process in Mozambique. The Peace Process Secretariat also has a website where you can see photos and learn more. That's at maputoaccord.org. Making Peace Visible is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. If you'd like to support more conversations like this one that demonstrate how peace gets made in difficult circumstances, head to makingpeacevisible.org and make a one-time or recurring donation. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrea Maraskin. The associate producer is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. Thanks for listening, and talk soon.